Hello, this is Vincent Green, and we're going to continue our study of the book of Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 10, and we're looking today at the descendants of Shem, starting at verse 21, going till the end of the chapter, verse 32. This is in a Toledot section that starts at chapter 10, verse 1, goes to chapter 11, verse 9. And so we've been looking at these descendant lists and looking at the different names and knowing that there are people groups, right? They're identified by clan, language, territory, national identity. So we've been seeing all that for Japheth and for Ham, except we did not look at verse 8 through 12 in regards to the descendants of Ham, that section, because that particular passage in relation to a guy named Nimrod, we're going to look at that next time as we'll finish the chapter today. We'll go back and look at verse 8 to 12 because it has a direct connection to chapter 11, verses 1 to 9, the Tower of Babel story. So today we'll be looking at the descendants of Shem, and I'm going to read the passage as we go and make comment as we go. But again, what you're going to see here is that God is still sovereignly moving and working to allow the people, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's three sons, to give birth, and those people give birth, and those people give birth, so that the world is being repopulated. The world is being repopulated. And again, as I've done before, in the previous two sessions, I will put a link into that same maps, and so you can kind of see where everybody goes and how the descendants moved out in terms of a geographical migrations. They all started in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, Mount Ararat, and then they dispersed from there, and people migrated. And there's interesting story in regards to all of that, and that's where it comes into with Nimrod and with the Tower of Babel, as we'll see starting next time. But let's start to work our way through the list here in regards to Shem. So it says, sons were also born to Shem. He is the older brother of Japheth. We've talked about this. So Shem's the oldest, then Japheth, then Ham. Shem was the ancestor of all the descendants of Eber. It's interesting that Moses puts this here. And by the way, if you compare verse 21 going down, especially through verse 20 or verse 30, you will find that those verses appear in the same order, in the same wording, pretty much in 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 17 to 20. So it's again another indication that the chronicler, the one who put together the book of Chronicles, to us 1st and 2nd Chronicles, some say that's Ezra, that the chronicler was connecting back at the very beginning to all of the history recorded in the book of Genesis. And so that's what these genealogical records, especially as you meet those genealogical records in the first, 8 or 9 chapters of the book of 1 Chronicles, and it's connecting back to all that history without having to repeat all of that history. That's what the chronicler is trying and attempting to do by wording it the way he is. And so he has grabbed that material, what he puts in chapter 1 is in from, the book of Genesis, those records, those accounts, because it's basically word for word. So Shem, it says, was the ancestor of all the descendants of Eber. It does not mean he's the father of Eber, because when you go down to verse 24, it says Shelah was the father of Eber. It just means that Shem was one of the ancestors, as it states. He would be like, great-grandfather or grandfather, that kind of thing. And so he would be an ancestor to the descendants of Eber. But you would ask, maybe why is Eber mentioned here? What is the significance of that? And it's because the very name Hebrew, the word Hebrew, was taken from the name Eber. In a sense, Eber is the father of the Hebrews. Those who would be that nation that God is going to raise up, as we will see the history of it moving forward in the book of Genesis, going through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We're going to see God give birth to a nation that is supposed to be representing Him to the rest of the world and shine the light of who God is, the Creator God, the sovereign God of the universe. Then shine that light to the rest of the world and tell the rest of the world that God is God. The reality is that the nation of Israel would never fulfill that. They would never do that. But the plan of God to bring the Messiah through the lineage of Israel, through the lineage of Eber, from Shem, is the way God has designed it. And so by Moses saying that here, wording that here under the inspiration of the Spirit, Shem was the ancestor of all the descendants of Eber. It puts an emphasis upon the list of descendants. It puts an emphasis upon the plan that God is doing, and that He is going to bring about His promised plan to bring about the promised seed into this world. And the promised seed is going to come from Shem. This is God's choice to bring about His redemption in the way that He says He will do, by bringing in the Messiah, His Son, and will destroy the head of Satan. And so there's going to be more said about that going forward, but you already get a taste. So these genealogical lists are not just names to read and move on. You sit and you take a little glance at this and meditate on this for a minute. You see that there's some significant points being made, because for Jews especially, knowing the linkage, to make sure that all of the data stays consistent so that everybody understands where all these things go back to. We have these genealogical records. They become like links in the chain that keep everything together. Now notice we get to verse 22. The descendants of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. And then it'll talk about the descendants of Aram, and then the descendants of Arphaxad. And so Eber is a great-grandson, because you got Shem, then you have Arphaxad, and then Shelah, verse 24, and then Shelah is the father of Eber. So, and it seems to be as though the way this is going is it gets, then it talks about Eber. So again, the genealogical record is selective. So let's go back up to verse 22. Shem, the descendants of Shem. So we have Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. So Elam settled east of the Mesopotamia beyond the Tigris River. So again, I told you I'll have a link to some maps so you can see where these people go. Mesopotamia is the name for the land between the Euphrates River, the Tigris Rivers. And so the Elamites covered an area from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf. They later united with the Media and formed the Great Persian Empire. And you can find Elam or Elamites first appeared in the time of Abraham. They actually joined forces with several other kingdoms, and they conquered Sodom and Gomorrah, and in the process took Lot, the nephew of Abraham, captive. So it says in Genesis 14, talks about how Abraham pursues the Elamites, defeated them, and freed Lot. Then you have Asher. These people were the Assyrians who settled in northern part of Mesopotamia along the region of the upper Tigris River. So Assyria was one of those kingdoms that talks about how Nimrod settled. And again, when we look at Nimrod, next time we'll look more into this. And the capital of that city that area of Assyria was Nineveh, the great capital that Nimrod builds. And Nineveh is the same city that Jonah is sent to years later to take the message of truth to them, the message of that the Lord would have. And so we deal with that when we get to the book of Jonah. Now, when it comes to Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram, let's deal with Aram, because you see Aram is mentioned in verse 23. The descendants of Aram were Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mosh. And there's no more mention of Lud. There is mention of Arphaxad. We'll talk about him when we get there. But Lud was the Lydians of Asia Minor. They became a part of that group. And so, again, people moved out in whatever region they were to go. So let's look at Aram. Uz, Hul, Gether, Mosh. Uz probably was a part of the Arabian desert. The actual location of Uz is unknown, but it is the homeland of another biblical character, name of Job. Job. And there's a book in the Bible about Job. There's a book in the Bible about Job. Now, here's what's interesting, though, is I told you Eber was the descendant of, or the founder of, and his name was elongated to be Hebrew, which became the name of that race of people. Well, there is a language. See, each group has their own language, right? It's called the Hebrew language. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew language. However, parts of the Old Testament is written in a different language called Aramaic. Aramaic. And it's what's interesting is that Aram, it's in Numbers 23:7, 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 6, but through their influence, the Aramaic language originated. And so when you look at a Hebrew Bible, what you're looking at, if you look at those characters and they go from right to left, it's interesting, you start at the back of the book and work the other way. But when you're looking at a Hebrew Bible, the script that is used is not Hebrew script. It is Aramaic script, but the grammar is Hebrew grammar. That's an interesting one. I remember when I was in seminary, in Bible college, learning Hebrew. I learned Greek much better, which is the language of the New Testament. Hebrew and Aramaic is the language of the Old Testament. There is an official Aramaic grammar, which is different than the Hebrew grammar, and parts of the book of Ezra and parts of the book of Daniel are written in an Aramaic language, Aramaic grammar, and instead of Hebrew. It's just very interesting the way that works. But when you're looking at it, it all looks the same. It's just the way the grammar is, you can tell the distinction. And so these all have foundations in this descendants list, this genealogical record here. So Uz is where Job is, the story of Job takes place. So it'll become a Gentile area. And there's a book in the Bible called Job, and it's one of the books that I'm going to be working through in terms of the Inductive Journey series. And eventually you'll see that. As of right now, I had been preaching through the book of Job, but I've decided to remove those sermons. And now I'm going to be putting a series together like I'm doing for Genesis. We're going to walk through the story of Job. It is a story, and it is a very fascinating one that each person needs to go through. And the time frame of Job is the same patriarchal period as would be Abraham and Isaac, that period of time. So it's just an interesting study. But Uz was, the descendants of Aram was Uz. Uz is the place that eventually where Job was born. Then you have Hul and Gether. Nothing's known except that they were Aramean and Syrian territories. It's all we can gather about them based on scholarship. Mosh, they either covered southern Armenia or else it was maybe where modern day Lebanon is right now. So again, these people are going out, descendants are going out. And so as you go down through this list, I mean, you can get into the weeds of all of this, but as we work through it, you'll see that there's some interesting information given. Now you have Arphaxad. Arphaxad is the father of Shelah. Shelah is the father of Eber. Now nothing is known about Arphaxad or his son Shelah, some call it Salah, except that they were the ancestors of Abraham and the chosen line. So as we go forward, if you glance over to chapter 11, you'll see where it talks about Shem. It talks about Shem, and then it'll say he became the father of Arphaxad. Arphaxad became the father of Shelah, and then Shelah became the father of Eber. So when we get to that other genealogical record, just of Shem and just of the chosen line lineage, then you will see that there's all this direct connection. So the point here is in verse 24, we get to Eber. So it's as though Moses is trying to get us to Eber, and Eber is that one, like I said, is the name for Hebrew. Hebrew. And so it's just a very interesting point to be made. But Eber, it says in verse 25, had 2 sons. The first was named Peleg, and his brother's name at the end of the verse, Joktan. Joktan. So we'll look at Joktan in a minute, but Peleg, this will give you a little bit of insight into verse 8 to 12 and chapter 11. So it says here about Peleg, the word Peleg means division. For during his lifetime, the people of the world were divided into different language groups. Oh. You get a little bit of a sneak preview of what's going to become dominant in this rest of this Toledot section when you add up verse 8 to 12 and connect that to the Tower of Babel story. We've been reading how these groups, sons are born and descendants are going out and they're migrating according to clan and language and territory and national identity. Did you know that at the very beginning, when it was just Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and sons are being born, that initially there was not that long, big scale migration? It wasn't happening. And there's a story to tell about that. By the time you get to Peleg, which based on the math, as we will see in chapter 11, working through, starting at verse 10, you see the language there, looking ahead in chapter 11. That language is similar to the way it was worded in chapter 5. And when you have it like that, it's connecting all the dots, going back from Shem, going back to Noah. And so there's this genealogical record that helps us to connect terms of time, in terms of the number of years. From the time 2 years after the great flood, it says in chapter 11, verse 10, he becomes the father of Arphaxad. Then Shem lives another 500 years. When Arphaxad's 35 years old, he becomes the father of Shelah. Right? You get the idea? Shelah was 30 years old, he became the father of Eber. And 34 years old after that, became the father of Peleg. If you do the math, that tells you that from Noah to Peleg is somewhat over, a little over 100 years or so? So by the time you get to over just 100 years after the time of the flood, that means Noah is still living, by the way. Right? Didn't Noah live many years after the flood? So Noah is still living when Peleg is born, and it's during the time of Peleg, says, during his lifetime, the people of the world were divided into different language groups. Oh. So what's going on here? Well, some would suggest that the division being spoken of here, because even his word means division, that it could be due to overpopulation, and so it's just the general need to move farther out, farther apart. And so some would say, well, Peleg led that division. Some even think that it could have been a catastrophic volcano eruption that divided the earth into continents and islands, and that the earth had been one huge land mass, and no substance to that view. Actually, it would be the flood that would make the earth be in the form in which it is in right now. The continental divides and the spreading of the land masses and the way the seas formed and all of that would be as a result of the flood, not of something else. So what is this division referring to? Well, it says here, just take the text, look at it, what it says. It was during his lifetime that the people of the world were divided into different language groups. When does that take place? During the time of Peleg. Is there a record of an event that talks about this? Yes, the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel. What does that mean? It means, which you may not have thought about this, that the Tower of Babel incident happens while Noah, Shem, Aram, Arphaxad, why all of these people are living. Noah is living during the time when the Tower of Babel story takes place. That's just a preview. That's just a preview. Because people were divided into different language groups during that period of time. Well, let's look at Joktan. Joktan, he has a lot of ancestors, 13 if you want to count them up. He is the other son of Eber. So you have Almodad. Almodad settled in South Arabia, possibly in the area of Al-Murad. Shelef, the area of Yemen, probably around Salaf or Sulaf. Hazar Maphith, Hazar Maphith or Maphith, the area of South Arabia, around an area called Hadaramut. Jerah, unknown, but perhaps close to the fortress known as Jericho or Jericho. Hadarum, most likely in the Yemen, somewhere in there. All of these people seems to be going based on, from what they can tell archaeologically, and you can see this on the maps, is the southern Arabia, what we call Saudi Arabia today, and the outlying areas of that. Uzal would name of the ancient capital of Yemen. Dikla, the name means date palm, probably a region where the fruit was plentiful, perhaps around the modern Dakhla in Yemen. Obal and Abimael, again, not good with all these names, trying to pronounce them. Rather unknown, but it could be in Arabia, most likely South Arabia. Then you got Sheba. Sheba is probably the group that would eventually be called the Sabaeans. The Sabaeans are a people who settled in southwest Arabia, and they are mentioned in the book of Job. Job chapter 1. Ophir, kind of unknown, but perhaps southern Arabia as well, the Persian Gulf. It's interesting, Solomon, when you had King Solomon, his ships used the port of Ophir for shipping cargo. You'll see that in 1 Kings 9, 1 Chronicles 29, 2 Chronicles 8, 2 Chronicles 9. So there's most likely a port city. And so the people came from Ophir. Havilah, settled on the border of Arabia, just north of Yemen. And then Jobab, sometimes thought to be associated with the area of Jahibab, which is located close to modern-day Mecca. So you have all of those descendants. It says all these were descendants of Joktan. The territory they occupied extended from Mesha all the way to Sephir in the eastern mountains. Mesha is in the north towards Sephir. The eastern hills or mountains. Exactly where these locations are, we are still unknown, but from what we can gather, it's what the boundary was within the Arabian area at that time. So Joktan, their people migrated there. So when you add all of this up, verse 31, these were the descendants of Shem, identified by clan, language, territory, and national identity. And Shem would be the race. The lineage would go through Shem, and as we will see in chapter 11, there are specific sons that would carry the lineage through to Abraham, all the way to David, and all the way to the Messiah. And this would be God's choice to accomplish His work of salvation in this way. Now, in terms of all these peoples that are mentioned from Japheth and Ham and Shem, every single person is personally accountable and responsible to God for either belief in God or unbelief in God, unbelief in God's plan, belief in God's plan, worshiping the Lord. And as we will see, as we go back and look at Nimrod next time, beginning to look at him and going into the Tower of Babel story, you're going to see how mankind is going to respond to God. And it is as though Noah, who is still living, is wondering, he's probably going to be scratching his head saying, this is like deja vu all over again. Because of what will transpire, of what will take place. The story cannot be missed, and the connections cannot be missed. God has a plan. And God will fulfill His plan. It's interesting, Paul would say this, and I think when I introduced chapter 10, I may have used this passage, but Paul says, God has made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth. And He has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. And when it comes to the gospel message, there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek. The same Lord is Lord over all. The line of Shem is going to become, through the Hebrews, through the lineage of Eber, down through Abraham, the chosen line that God was going to use to send the promised seed. And the gospel will go forth because of what the Messiah will do. The final verse, verse 32, it says, these are the clans that descended from Noah's sons. They're arranged by nation according to their lines of descent. So when even though you may see the name of a son, they become the leader of a people. They become a clan, right? A language, a territory, these groups of people. All of the nations of the earth descended from these clans after the great flood. And the great flood is a reference back to the worldwide flood, God's worldwide judgment, which he says that he will not do that again. He will judge the world. Next time it's going to be by fire, and when he does it by fire, he's going to literally uncreate it and establish a new heaven and a new earth. That's at the end. That's at the very end. But for now, peoples are being born. Nations are being given birth to. But God has a special nation that he's going to work through to bring about his promised seed, who will wipe out Satan and sin forever. But before we get introduced to that story, we have to dive more deeply into what happened a little over 100 years after the flood. What did Noah witness? What did God do? How is mankind living 100 years after the flood? We see the descendants, we see these peoples and kind of where they go based on all the evidence that we can see. But the bigger question is, what are they doing where they're living? What causes them to have to divide from each other like they did? It's a very interesting story. Many of you have heard it about the Tower of Babel. But when you look deeply into the text, as we are going to do over the coming sessions, you're going to see some things very, very interesting. Some things you may not have thought about before contained in this story about Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. Special story indeed. It's going to help us to understand the plight of humanity and the saving grace of God. Let's pray. Dear God, we do thank you again for this time to look at your word, to see your truth. Lord, your word is so special. It's so unique. And Lord, as we go through all these names and see all these people moving around, going to different locations, the larger story is that you've oversaw all of that, especially in light of what happens just 100 years or so after the Great Flood. On every page we see your sovereignty, your lordship, your majesty. You are supreme, and that we know very well. Lord, we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we have finished technically the chapter 10, but we got to go back and look at verse 8 to 12. And then after we look at that section, which these are the events, verse 8 to 12, and then verse 11, or chapter 11, verse 1 to 9, which that'll finish the Toledo section. But that is what happens in the time of Peleg. So we'll go back and do all of that starting next time. And it's going to be a very, very interesting story. Take care. God's blessings be upon you. Share this with others. Share about the series, the YouTube channel, everything going on. And take care. God's blessings. We'll see you next time.